So one day he had him a wheel, and he started out. He sold his horse and buggy, sold his horse, left his buggy for his brother. He took half the money and his wheel and rode over to Lawrenceville, Illinois, over there to his uncles and his cousins over there, and visited a while. And from then he got set of his wheel, caught the train for the West. Well, I could back up a little. 6 years before, his brother had left for Walla Walla, Washington. He went out there, and then he got over into eastern Oregon, Wallowa County, and homesteaded there on the 160 acres of fine timber. It wasn't long till he had his fence up and his cottage up to live in, and his wood all in, fixed up for the winter. But he'd go out to Blaylock Fruit Ranch at Walla Walla, Washington there, and work on the big ranch and get his money to live on while he worked on his farm, his homestead. Well, from there, Chuck had got his mandolin again, so he would practice on his mandolin. And there, after he got on his train, back up a little bit, when he started in on his train, he tripped to Oregon. He went into Fayette, Missouri, where his sister lived. His brother-in-law was teaching there in the Fayette College in Missouri. Oh, he went from there then, got on the train, and went on into across the country and through the mountains. But before he got to the Rocky Mountains, going into Denver, he could see a big cloud bank, looked like a bunch of clouds. But the closer he got, why, he began to see something was in the making. Well, he had heard of the Rocky Mountains, so all at once it struck him. Well, there's the Rocky Mountains. Great scene for the little boy. Of course, he wasn't so little at that time. He said he looked and watched, but he said the clouds kept getting bigger and bigger, and finally when it got up to where he could see the snow and see everything, and he decided that it was the Rocky Mountains. And that is a high point in his life, going west, leaving Indiana. Of course, you know, his forefathers and all were wanderers. They rolled around from Pennsylvania to Virginia and into Indiana, and of course that got in his blood, and so Chuck was a kind of a runaround anyhow. It took him a week on the train to get out to his brother's. He got into his brother's there, and he finally went into the place there. Why, before that, though, he'd met a family that was going to Wenatchee, Washington, in a big fruit country up there. So this boy and a girl was about Chuck's age, so they hit it off pretty well. So he kind of fell in love with the girl, and the people all fell in love with him, and they wanted him to go on up and work with them on the fruit ranch in Wenatchee. But he wouldn't get to see his brother that way, and so that's what he had went for. And so he got off the train though at Pendleton, Oregon, and went on up to Walla Walla and went out on the fruit ranch. When he got there, he had just $5 left in his pocket. Well, so he told his brother, and met him after the folks where he went in, their old friends. He went into their house, and they found out who he was. They hid him away and told him to stay in the room, and when his brother come, why, they would tell him there's a package in there for him. So they did. When his brother come, why, they told him, it says, there's a package in there for you in the front room. So he went in, and it was a big package, all right. It was his kid brother. Well, we had quite a reunion, and he hadn't been home for almost 6 years. And so I was sure glad to see him. And of course, little Chuck had grown up. And he weighed around 150 pounds. So he had his $5, but his brother finally went to the boss. They had 18 men, so on the farm they had cattle. They'd feed cattle and had the fruits of all kinds and asparagus. It's a great layout. So he and his brother then teamed up. And they went to the boss and asked him if he could give me work. He said yes. He said Chuck can work, start to work whenever he feels like it. He said he's been on the road for about a week. He said he must be tired, so let him rest. So Chuck bummed around with his brother there and fed cattle and hogs and everything. Of course, everything was fed alfalfa at that time. The hogs got alfalfa the same as the cattle did. The cattle was shipped in from Texas, some big longhorn cattle, and they were shipped in there to feed out. Well, of course, you wouldn't dare get off the hay wagon, and when you was feeding, you had to stay on the wagon because those little longhorns, they didn't like a man anyhow. So we had a barn dog, though, that went along, and Chuck said the old dog would run out quick as he'd open the gate. He'd run out into the cattle and run them all off so they could drive the wagon through and feed the cattle. Well, it lasted that till up towards Christmas, and we started out from there then. Got our belongings and our packs and our felt boots on and everything, and we took off rode the train around to Elgin. That was the entrance to the Wallowa River Valley. And so we went to Elgin on the train, and we got off the train there. And in the afternoon we walked in several miles in on the stagecoach road from Elgin into the Minham. That was a canyon station for the stagecoaches to stop and change horses. Well, we walked on down the three switchbacks on the mountains going down into the valley. So we finally got down. Then we started up the river in the canyon. Got up about 4 or 5 miles. There's 9 miles of it was canyon. The road just followed the river around. Well, we got up there and but I forgot to tell you that we had got out of Elgin a piece. There, Luther went. We stopped at a farmhouse, and Luther, he goes in and asked him if he and Chuck could stay all night, and he said yes. They'd take care of him. In those days, you didn't have to go to hunt a place to stay all night. So he and Chuck, they took him in, give them their supper and their breakfast, and started us out early the next morning on a trip. The fellows wouldn't take any money. They said no. Says you go on. Says we help people and they help us. So that was the spirit of the people there in Oregon, where they were homesteading and building up the country. So when we got down when going into the canyon was rough, but after they got started up the canyon, my Chuck said they got about 4 or 5 miles up, and then they took out over the rim of the canyon to up on top to start across country towards his homestead. Well, the snow was about 2.5 foot deep there, and so Chuck said he'd break snow a while, and his brothers break snow a while, and they kept that up till long in the afternoon. Finally, they run on to the road that went from Wallowa up to Palace up to a little town above there of Paradise. But finally, the mail carrier all went through there, and Chuck said they was walking along the road, and it's getting dark and long. They was getting tired and wore out too. They was waded snow and walked and carried their pack. It was a tough old grind, but said they was feeling good. And they got when they got in the road, they eased up. Then it was only a few miles away from the from his homestead. So it was about, well, it was good and dark. They couldn't see very far, and so they'd walked about a mile, they said. They got along, and they heard something behind them, so they waited, and it kept getting closer and closer. Finally, when they got up there was his brother's friend, neighbor from there. He had his sleigh, and so there we got a break. They loaded in Chuck's stuff and carried that stuff on the old sled, and they rode the sled. They said ran into his neighbor's home. Well, his neighbor wouldn't let the kids go on up to Luther's homestead, so they stopped there at Luther's neighbor's and stayed all night and got a good supper and a warm breakfast there, and then went on over to the cottage and his cabin and dug into the potatoes he had buried and got potatoes out and got some stuff that they had taken with them, and so they got him a little meal for noon. And that day, the mailman would come through. So the mailman started out, he'd start on out to Willow to get the mail, so his brother Luther went and made out a list of the groceries and things that they needed, and he goes down and flags the mailman down and gives him the order. And the mailman goes out, and the next day, we had our grub and stuff all brought in. And it's about 300-400 yards, I guess, down to where the road was. It was quite a slope up to the cabin. So his brother fixed an old sled of stuff there and tied a rope on it. He went down and met Chuck said they went down and met the mailman the next day and loaded their stuff on the sled and pulled it up to the cabin. They put all the sugar and the flour and the bacon and everything like that. Of course, they had the potatoes, and boy, were they good. They were buried in the dirt and the pine needles and all, and they sure had a flavor. Chuck said they were delicious. Well, the winter went on. Chuck had already put in his application and was studying for studying to be an electrician. So he, in getting his electric work, he sat and studied and finally he'd get tired, and then he'd go out and help his brother split rails and make posts. So one day he was sitting there studying, and it got so still he couldn't even think. There wasn't a noise of any kind. There wasn't a bird or a squirrel or anything, he said, making a noise. So he couldn't stand it. He got up and went to the door. He looked out, and there wasn't a breeze. There wasn't a thing moving. And he said it was just like death. He said what he thought. So he happened to look up, and way up in the treetops, there was big flakes of snow coming down. Well, it come on down and kept drifting down, and looked like they never get to the ground. There was no breeze, no nothing. So they finally drifted down. And Chuck said he stood there and watched the marvelous things occurring, and said all at once, here come his brother Luther just up through the snow a-tearing. He said, coming into the house. He said, well, we're going to have a big snow. He says, get everything ready. So, of course, we went to work and got everything all in the houses and fixed up and got ready for the snow. We had about 9 inches that night. Next morning we got up and everything was just loaded down with snow, and the birds and the squirrels was just a-chirping and everything was alive. My, it sounded good. So that kept on for a while. Finally, one day, Chuck was studying, he heard an awful noise, a roar, and it said it just kept roaring, and kept getting worse, and he couldn't figure out what in the world was going on. Well, it happened at the Cougar Canyon. Ended right up there close to his farm, and the waterfall, there's a big waterfall there about 200-300 feet right down into the canyon. Well, that was the roar. His brother told him that's what it was. So the Chinook winds had come in, and in that country, that means the snow melts and leaves. So it kept blowing and blowing day in and day out, and the snow kept going, and the roar kept getting louder. Finally, you could begin to see some dirt, and see the soil and the grass, and there was some places there you could see little flowers already out in bloom. And it warmed up gradually, and it was beautiful in there, and it was a wonderful place to live. But we couldn't stay in there, had to go out, so my brother had to go back over into Washington to work and get more money. But Chuck, he goes down into Olau, and there he finds a job at the stagecoach barn, taking care of the stagecoach horses and changing them from the horses at the station there. And Olau had a big barn, stage barn there, and it was long enough, the driveway, that they could drive 6 head of horses in the stagecoach inside to change them, because the winters were bad there. Sometimes, a lot of times, you get below zero. Snow was deep, so that's kind of a place that Chuck got into to work. Well, that wasn't so bad, but the stagecoach company would go up in Yakima Valley in Washington and pick up all those wild horses and bring them down there, and that's about the only kind of horses that could stand the driving and the pulling of those stagecoaches. So that's kind of a rough deal that Chuck got into, but he was raised on a farm and that was well acquainted with breaking horses and one thing and another, and so he got to apply some of his trade there. One day he went in to fix up one of the horses, put the harness on the horses, and one old horse there that had his head caved in sometime because one ear stuck straight up and it wouldn't move. But he'd put all the harness on the old horse, but they put the hames, fastened the hames up on the collar, and he happened to look up, and the old horse had his teeth bared and his mouth open. He was coming right at him, was going to bite his arm. So he just jumped back and picked up the bridle that was hanging there and hauled off, and he hit the old horse on the head right where that caved-in place was. Well, the old horse jumped up in the corner and just shook like a leaf. You guess he's been hit before. But he got along all right then. From that time on, that old horse was a good old horse. But fall kept coming on, and his boss sent him over with the horses to have the ice caulks put on them. And so that meant these long steel caulks was in their shoes. They were about inch to inch and a quarter, long, and they were sharp. And they was to help the stagecoach horses to pull the stage on ice and through the snow and all. So they one day it was muddy and bad, and it got muddy and bad, and the horses, of course, had mud all over them, but you couldn't curry them. You had to take them down to the river and flush them around in the river and wash them off. And they wouldn't let you touch them with a curry comb. They'd just take off. And so they had to we'd brush their necks and their backs, and then they were clean. So this one time, though, Chuck had taken the horses down and brought them back up. He rode them into the stage barn there and tied them up down at the end of the driveway, and the driveway was wide enough to drive 2 stagecoaches in side by side. Well, we had straps on the side of the walls there, and we strapped those wild horses to those heavy straps so they couldn't get away. So he took these horses in, he said, snapped them up to the wall, and went back to the back end, untied the horses from their tails, and run them into their stalls. Well, he got up to that close to the middle of the barn, just opposite the bedroom where Chuck slept, and there was this old horse standing there half asleep or something. He had his head down, and when Chuck went up and took a hold of his rope to untie him, he just wheeled around, snorted like a wild animal, and just wheeled around and kicked Chuck clear across the driveway right at the bedroom door. Well, he looked up, and the old boy was kicking right over his head, so he laid flat till finally the horse broke loose and went back in his stall. Well, the next morning, his brother and the other men up there, the 7 of them, was all going deer hunting. And Chuck was supposed to be ready to go, he said. But that kick put him in the bed for the day or 2 after that. He stuck 3 corks in the back of his leg. He'd have ruined him if he'd kicked him in the front, but he happened to kick him from behind, and he stuck those corks in his leg, and his leg all swelled up. But they kept big bottles of all the wintergreen in there for the horses and the veterinary work. And so he just got that, all the wintergreen, he said, and started to bathing his leg, and he'd bathe his leg, and every once in a while just kept it soaked with that, and massaged it and everything, and by morning it was something like a barrel. But his brother come in and he said, well, he said, you ready? Chuck says, yeah, look at that. So they had a little talk, and finally his brother went on up deer hunting, and they come back 7 deer and a bear. Well, Chuck missed that big hunt, but he was glad to have his leg. So his leg kept getting better and better, and finally it got on all right, healed over, and today Chuck's leg is still doing its work. Well, that was part of it. So then the next few days after that, why, the snow had been melting up in the mountains, and it had come a rain, and of course you know what these mountain streams do. He said they just come up in a day's time, and then they're down another day or 2. And so he happened to be down there washing the horses off at one time when the river was up. Well, he washed the horses off all right, got them out into the deep water, and there's 2 of them went under, and they finally got up. And then all at once, while the water washed the feet out from under the horse that Chuck was riding, and he was over next to the bank, but if he'd have jumped upstream to the bank, he'd have washed right back under the horse, so he only had one choice, and that was to swim that river across and to the end of the rapids. The rapids were right below him, about 100 feet or more, so it was a swim or die. So Chuck said he struck right out for the end of the rapids on the on an angle. Said he was a limb there. Said he thought the good Lord put it there on purpose because every time that limb would go, the water would pull it down, then it'd fly back. Then the water would pull it down, and it'd fly back again. So just as Chuck got to that corner where he used to either go over the rapids or else land on the bank, he grabbed that limb. Well, that throwed him around. He got on the bank and got out and was safe. So he went down to the bridge then where he should have crossed, but he didn't. He crossed through where they always forded the river, but the horses had more sense than Chuck, so they went down to the bridge. And Chuck met him down there and got on him again, took him into the barn. Well, what hurt Chuck was that there's some fellas up there on the corner and the street waiting when he said when he come along, they all gave him the horse laugh because he was the one that got ducked that time in the place of the horses. The rough stuff kept going on, and Chuck finally fell in love with the boss's daughter, the only daughter they had. So everything was going lovely, and they one time the stagecoach horses got in and anxious to run, and when they was coming out of the canyon, they had 15 miles to go. So the canyon was 9 miles. They had 6 miles from there into the Wallowa. So when Chuck said the driver told him he got out of the canyon, the horses wanted to run anyhow, but he couldn't let them run there in the canyon because there was a fall in the river, and the stagecoach was just full of people, and there was baggage tied all over it, and one man on the front seat with the driver. So when they got out to the end of the canyon, why, there was 5 miles of straight road, just level. Well, he never thought. He just reached down and took his long whip, and he cracked it right between the leaders. Well, those leaders, they laid down, and of course the wheel horses had to follow, and away they went. He said that he never thought what he'd done, but he did learn that he couldn't crack his whip between the horses unless they expected to run off. So they run away. They run for 6 miles just as hard as they could go, and finally they got to the corner where they had another mile to go into town. Then's when the driver said he got scared. So he didn't let anybody know that they were running off, but he finally got them settled down enough, and the horses had always made that turn, and so when they got to there, the horses began to realize they had to make a turn. They slowed down, and finally he made it around the curve, but he looked for the old stagecoach to roll, but it was loaded too heavy, so it stayed on its wheels, and they turned around, and he let them loose, and they went for another mile as far as they could go. Well, they pulled up the stage, always stopped at the hotel, and then come on over to the stage barn. They have to change horses. Well, when that happened, why, they pulled up to the hotel and stopped, and the passengers all got out, and finally, when some of them got out, and they said to the stage driver, he says, "Well," he says, "you people sure do know how to drive, don't you?" Well, he took them for a ride all right, but they didn't know the team was running off. But all those things went in stride. It was a rough country, wild and woolly, and mountain lions running all around, and the elk and the deer, and so it was a nice, wonderful place to live. But finally his brother Luther come along,